It was supposed to be just another quiet morning. The town had barely woken up, the streets still wrapped in the pale light of dawn. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air after a late-night drizzle, and for most people, the day began as it always did. Coffee brewing, newspapers landing on front porches, the hum of engines warming up. Maggie Reed took a sip of her coffee, standing on her porch like she did every morning. The neighborhood was still half asleep, the houses across the street quiet and undisturbed. Yet something felt off. She couldn't quite place it at first. Then she noticed it, the Flaherty house. It stood still, almost too still. No movement inside, no sign of Kayla stepping out for her usual morning jog. The porch light was still on, flickering slightly, as if someone had forgotten to turn it off. That wasn't like Kayla. She was a creature of habit. She always turned off the light before leaving. She always jogged at the same time. She always followed a routine. Maggie's unease deepened as she pulled out her phone, absently scrolling through messages. Then she saw it, a text from Kayla, sent at 1:27 a.m. "If anything happens to me, just remember, I tried to leave." Maggie's heart clenched. She read it again, hoping she had misinterpreted, that maybe it was part of some unrelated conversation. But the words sat there, unchanging, ominous, final. She quickly typed a response. "Kayla? What's going on?" No reply. She hesitated only a moment before calling. The phone rang twice, then went to voicemail. Her fingers tightened around the device, a cold sensation creeping up her spine. Kayla never ignored messages, let alone calls. A thought struck her. What if she was inside? What if something had happened? She set down her coffee and crossed the street, her pace quickening with every step. Standing at the front door, she knocked firmly. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. The silence on the other side felt heavy, unnatural. She reached for the handle. It was locked. Her breathing grew shallow. This wasn't right. Kayla should be home. Or if she had gone somewhere, she would have answered. The text replayed in Maggie's mind like a warning she had received too late. She reached for her phone and dialed 911. Within 10 minutes, Officer James Connolly pulled up in his patrol car. He was one of the more seasoned officers in town, a man who had seen his fair share of incidents, but mostly minor ones: domestic disputes, noise complaints, the occasional stolen bike. He had known Kayla for years, had seen her at the grocery store, exchanged pleasantries in passing. That familiarity was in his voice when he spoke. "What's going on?" Maggie handed him her phone. "She sent me this last night. I've been trying to call her, but there's no answer. Her car is gone, but something feels wrong." Connolly's eyes darkened as he read the message. He didn't waste time. He knocked on the door, announced himself. When there was no response, he radioed for backup and had the landlord, who lived nearby, bring over a spare key. The lock clicked open. The door creaked slightly as it swung inward. Everything looked normal, but only on the surface. The living room was tidy, as if someone had just cleaned. A purse sat on the kitchen counter. A phone, Kayla's phone, was lying next to it, turned off. A half-empty coffee mug rested on the table, the liquid inside long gone cold. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows, yet something in the air felt wrong. Then Connolly's gaze landed on the floor, a faint red smear near the edge of the carpet. It had been wiped, almost completely cleaned, but under the glow of the morning light, it was still visible, a stain that shouldn't have been there. He exhaled sharply and turned to Maggie. "You said she sent you that message at 1:30? Maggie nodded, her throat suddenly dry. Connolly lifted his radio. "We've got a potential crime scene." 15 minutes later, Daniel Flaherty pulled into the driveway. He stepped out of his truck quickly. Dressed in a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, his face twisted in a mixture of worry and confusion. His eyes scanned the scene, moving from the police officer to the open door of his home. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice thick with urgency. "Where's Kayla?" Connolly faced him, measured. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Last night. She said she was going to see her mom." His voice wavered slightly. "I fell asleep before she left. He gestured toward the house. "What happened?" Connolly studied him carefully. "Her mother says she never arrived. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His expression flickered with something, confusion, maybe, or something else. I don't, I don't understand, he said. She never came back? Connolly let the question hang. The air between them was thick with tension. Maggie watched Daniel carefully, noting every shift in his body language. I tried calling her, she said quietly. She didn't answer. She probably just needed space, Daniel said quickly, too quickly. Did she say anything before she left? Connolly asked. Daniel hesitated. We argued, he admitted, about the divorce. But she was upset, not... She wasn't in danger or anything. The word lingered. Divorce. Maggie felt something cold settle in her chest. Something terrible had happened. By noon, the town was in motion. Flyers were being printed. Volunteers were organizing a search party. Local news stations were picking up the story. The hope, of course, was that Kayla had just left to clear her head, that she would return home once she had time to breathe. But Maggie knew better. Kayla's text, the silent house, the red stain on the floor. Kayla hadn't left. Something had taken her, or someone, and whoever it was had been inside that house. The first 24 hours of a missing person case were the most critical. Every detective knew that. The longer someone was gone, the harder it became to find them, alive. By midday, Kayla Flaherty's face was everywhere. Flyers with her smiling picture, taken just months ago at a neighborhood barbecue, were taped to telephone poles, pinned on bulletin boards at gas stations, and shared across social media. The words missing sat in bold letters above her name, and below it, the details of her last known whereabouts. People whispered, speculated. Some were convinced she had simply needed a break, a temporary escape from the stress of her divorce. Others, the ones who knew better, felt something much darker pressing against their chests. Inside the Flaherty home, the crime scene team worked methodically. Every inch of the house was examined, every possible clue cataloged. The red smear on the living room floor had already been photographed and swabbed. Even though it had been partially cleaned, luminol testing would confirm whether it was blood. That wasn't all they found. A closer look at the bathroom revealed something unsettling, a damp towel, stained with faint streaks of pink, discarded in the hamper. Under the sink, a roll of paper towels was missing half its sheets, and inside the trash can, beneath ordinary household waste, were more stained rags. Not fresh, but not old either. Signs of a mess someone had tried to clean. In the bedroom, Kayla's closet remained untouched. Her clothes, neatly arranged by color, stood just as they had been the last time Maggie visited. But something was missing. Her suitcase, a bag she always kept in the corner, the one she used for weekend trips to visit her family, was gone. If she had truly left of her own accord, she would have taken more than just her car keys and wallet. The bed was made, the sheets tucked in perfectly. The air in the room felt stale, as if no one had slept there the night before. The window was cracked open slightly, letting in the crisp October air. It was an insignificant detail, perhaps, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. Downstairs, Officer Connolly examined the kitchen. The half-empty coffee mug sat untouched, the liquid inside forming a thin film on its surface. Next to it, Kayla's phone remained powered off. It had been placed on the counter as if someone had deliberately left it behind. That, more than anything, disturbed him. Most people never willingly parted with their phones, especially not in a moment of distress. If Kayla had left the house willingly, why wouldn't she have taken it with her? Outside, the search for Kayla expanded. Volunteers gathered in small groups, fanning out across town. They checked the parks she liked to visit, the coffee shops she frequented, even the library where she sometimes went to escape the chaos of home. But there was no sign of her. The hours ticked by, the unease spreading. Then just before sunset, a new discovery changed everything. A group of searchers had made their way to the outskirts of town, near an old service road leading toward the river. It was a stretch of road rarely traveled, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown brush. They had almost turned back when one of them spotted something near the tree line. At first it looked like nothing, just discarded trash, another piece of debris left behind by careless travelers. But as they got closer, they saw the unmistakable shape of a burned-out vehicle. The smell of charred metal and plastic still lingered in the air. The windows were shattered, the tires melted down to their rims, The body of the car, once a dark blue, was now blackened with soot and ash. The license plate was barely visible, warped from the heat, but still readable. It was Kayla's car. Word spread quickly. Within minutes, police were on the scene, securing the area as night fell around them. Flashlights flickered through the darkness, illuminating the wreckage. The fire had been intense, but not enough to destroy everything. What they found inside made the air turn thick with dread. The front seats were almost entirely gone, reduced to twisted metal frames. The dashboard was a melted ruin, the steering wheel barely recognizable. But in the back seat, something remained. A shape. At first, it was unidentifiable, just a dark mass curled in on itself. But as one of the forensic investigators stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight revealed what lay beneath the charred remains of the upholstery. A human form. The body was unrecognizable, burned beyond immediate identification. But there was no question who it was. The way the body had been positioned, the way it had been left behind, it told a story. Someone had put it there. Someone had wanted it to disappear. The search for Kayla Flaherty was over. The search for her killer had just begun. The scent of burned metal, plastic, and something worse clung to the air long after the flames had died. Even as the cool night breeze swept through the clearing, the acrid stench lingered, wrapping itself around everything. The wreckage of Kayla Flaherty's car sat in eerie silence, the blackened frame still smoldering in places. The sight of it had already drawn a small crowd of volunteers who had been searching for her, but now, with police tape cutting across the clearing, only the investigators remained. Officer James Connolly stood just beyond the perimeter, his eyes fixed on the scene. The body in the back seat was nothing more than a charred silhouette, curled inward like someone caught in their final moments of terror. Even in the dim glow of the floodlights, the image was impossible to erase. The medical examiner, Dr. Ellen Parker, worked quietly alongside the forensic team, their gloved hands moving carefully through the remains of the car. Every inch of the vehicle had to be examined. Every scrap of evidence documented before the body was removed. Despite the severity of the fire, certain things had survived. A watch, its face cracked but still recognizable, clung stubbornly to what remained of a wrist. Fragments of fabric, burned but not completely destroyed, clung to the seatbelt. A wedding ring, fused to the heat-warped metal of the console, glowed dully under the artificial light. But there was something else, something that didn't belong in a fire this intense. The rear passenger side window had been shattered, not melted. That suggested it had been broken before the fire. And the body, though damaged almost beyond recognition, didn't look like it had moved much. If someone had died in the fire, there should have been signs of struggling, of shifting in an attempt to escape. But this body looked placed. Connolly's stomach tightened at the thought. Someone had gone through a great deal of effort to make sure Kayla Flaherty was found like this. Or maybe they had hoped she wouldn't be found at all. The forensic team worked through the night, carefully removing the remains from the vehicle. The next steps were clear: DNA testing, dental records, any means necessary to confirm what they already suspected. But the truth was, there was no real doubt. Kayla was gone. By morning, the news had spread across the town. The woman who had been missing less than a day had been found in the most horrifying way imaginable. The hope that had briefly flickered among the volunteers searching for her was gone now, replaced by the heavy weight of grief. But for law enforcement, grief had to wait. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was a crime scene, and that meant finding the person responsible. Investigators retraced every step of Kayla's last known movements, piecing together the fragments of time between when she was last seen and when her car was found. The text she had sent to Maggie at 1:27 a.m. now carried even more weight. She had been afraid. She had known something was wrong. But what had happened in the hours that followed? Security footage from nearby businesses was collected, reviewed frame by frame. A gas station 2 miles from the Flaherty home had a camera facing the street. The grainy, low-resolution video wasn't perfect, but it caught something, or rather, someone. A vehicle matching the description of Kayla's Toyota Highlander passed by around 4:15 a.m. At first glance, it could have been her driving, but there was something off. The way the car moved, too steady, too controlled. The driver never slowed, never hesitated. The person behind the wheel wasn't a woman running from something. It was someone following a plan. And then there was another detail. The taillights flickered as the car turned the corner. A barely noticeable detail except for one thing. Daniel Flaherty's truck had the same flickering taillight. Connolly knew that wasn't enough to prove anything. It was a lead, but not a conviction. The question remained, where had Kayla been in those missing hours? Her home, though quiet, was still under scrutiny. Officers combed through the rooms again, this time with more focus. They knew they weren't looking for signs of a missing person anymore. They were looking for signs of a crime scene. Blood testing confirmed that the red smear on the living room floor was Kayla's. Not enough for a fatal injury, but enough to prove she had been hurt before she left, or before she was taken. More details emerged, small but significant. The shower drain contained traces of blood, washed away but not entirely gone. A small dent in the drywall, low to the ground, as if something or someone had struck it hard. The pieces were adding up, but the picture they were forming was still incomplete. By the afternoon, Daniel Flaherty had been brought in for formal questioning. The man who had stood on his front lawn, insisting he had no idea where his wife had gone, now sat in a stark interrogation room, his fingers clasped tightly in front of him. His expression was composed, but there was tension in his shoulders, in the tightness of his jaw. He repeated what he had said before. Kayla left at 1:30 a.m. She was upset, but she said she was going to see her mother. He hadn't seen or heard from her since, but now there were more questions. Why hadn't he called her? If his wife had truly driven off in the middle of the night, wouldn't a concerned husband have checked in on her? Why had he scrubbed the floor? Why had there been blood in the shower? And then the most damning question of all, if Kayla had left at 1:30 a.m., why was her car seen on the road at 4:15 a.m., heading in the direction of the river? Daniel didn't have an answer for that. The silence stretched between him and the detectives. Outside, beyond the police station, the town was still in shock. People whispered about the tragedy, about the fire, about the fact that just hours earlier, they had been hoping Kayla was still out there, somewhere. Now they knew the truth. The only question left was who had done this to her, and, more importantly, why. The walls of the interrogation room were bare, the kind of muted gray that seemed to absorb sound. The air was stale, thick with the weight of expectation. Daniel Flaherty sat at the metal table, his hands resting motionless in front of him. The room's only light cast a dull glow over his face, highlighting the tautness of his jaw, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Outside, beyond the walls of the police station, the town had already decided. People murmured in grocery store aisles, whispered over gas pumps, passed quiet judgments in the corners of coffee shops. The missing woman had been found. The crime was undeniable. Now they were waiting for the only thing left, the name of the person responsible. But inside this room, there were still questions. Investigators weren't ready to declare guilt. Not yet. The case had too many moving parts, too many details that needed to be sealed tight before an arrest could be made. For now, they needed Daniel to talk, to explain the inconsistencies in his story, to account for the hours that had slipped through his fingers like sand. The blood in the living room, partially cleaned but not completely erased. The shower drain where water had tried to wash away something it couldn't quite hide. The dent in the drywall, low to the ground, just large enough to suggest impact. The car, burned and abandoned, with a body inside. And the time, the silent, unaccounted for stretch of hours between when Daniel claimed his wife had left the house and when her car had been seen heading toward the river. Time had a way of unraveling lies. While Daniel sat in the station, forensic teams continued combing through every inch of evidence. The crime scene technicians worked methodically, following each thread of the story left behind. The house, so carefully cleaned, still whispered its secrets. A partial fingerprint smudged on the edge of the bathroom counter, almost lost beneath the harsh light of forensic dusting. A single strand of hair, tangled in the fibers of the bedroom carpet. The faint imprint of a shoe near the back door, barely visible to the naked eye. All of it spoke of movement, of action, of something that had happened within those walls long after the world outside had gone quiet. Then there were the digital traces. In a world where every movement left behind an invisible footprint, Kayla's absence told a story of its own. Her phone, found powered down on the kitchen counter, hadn't been used since just after 1:30 a.m., the same time Daniel insisted she had left. But before it had gone silent, it had connected briefly to their home's Wi-Fi, just long enough for one last search. One phrase typed in the search bar, but never followed through: how to leave safely. It was a whisper, a trace of fear locked inside a screen, a question never answered. The evidence outside the home painted an even darker picture. Forensic teams had returned to the site where Kayla's car had been found, sifting through the burned remains with the precision of those who had seen too much, but still looked for more. Beneath the layers of ash and melted plastic, something had survived, a scrap of fabric wedged deep into the crevice of the back seat. It was singed at the edges, but its color still lingered, a deep navy blue. Not the color of anything Kayla had been wearing the last time she was seen. It was small, but small details had a way of unraveling the biggest lies. Then came the footage. The grainy security camera footage from the gas station had been scrubbed frame by frame, its poor resolution enhanced just enough to make out shapes and patterns. The Highlander had driven past at 4:15 a.m., heading toward the river, its tail light flickering, just like Daniel's truck. The plate wasn't visible, the driver's face nothing more than a shadow, but there was something else. A second vehicle, a truck, barely distinguishable in the footage, moving in the same direction, minutes apart. Daniel's truck. The gap between them was small, too small to be coincidence. The two vehicles had traveled together, following the same path into the darkness. Back in the interrogation room, time pressed down on Daniel. He hadn't asked for a lawyer yet. That in itself was telling. Guilty men either denied everything outright or demanded counsel before the first question was finished. But Daniel sat still, waiting, his breathing measured, his expression a mask. It was an old detective saying, the guilty talk too much, the innocent not enough. Daniel was somewhere in between. But outside that room, beyond the thick walls and locked doors, the town was already drawing its own conclusions. The burned car, the broken timeline, the husband who had stood in his driveway only hours before, claiming he had no idea where his wife had gone. People were waiting. The next move belonged to the investigators. They weren't going to rush. They weren't going to let emotion dictate the course of justice. But one truth remained, undeniable and inescapable. Kayla Flaherty hadn't left her house that night of her own free will. Someone had taken her, and that someone was sitting in this room, counting the seconds until the walls finally closed in. The weight of the investigation pressed down on every corner of the town. What had once been whispered suspicions now carried the sharp edge of certainty. The burned-out wreckage, the timeline that didn't fit, the husband who said too little. It was all converging into something undeniable. Yet the case still lacked one final, irrefutable piece. Daniel Flaherty remained in the interrogation room, his silence stretching into hours. The air inside was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of knowledge neither side wanted to be the first to voice. Outside, detectives combed through new evidence. Forensic analysts worked through the details they had pulled from the wreckage, and officers revisited every step of that night, searching for something, anything that would bring the last missing puzzle piece into place. The forensic lab delivered the first breakthrough. The fabric scrap found in the back seat of Kayla's burned-out car had yielded something unexpected, a tiny trace of adhesive residue. It was the kind used in duct tape. Even through the fire's destruction, something had survived, something that pointed to restraint. Kayla hadn't simply been placed in the car. She had been restrained, bound. That changed everything. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It wasn't a spontaneous act fueled by anger. It was planned, thought out, executed with purpose. Someone had gone through the steps necessary to ensure that Kayla wasn't just gone, but that she wouldn't be found, at least not easily. The forensic sweep of Daniel's truck turned up something else. Tiny specks, almost invisible to the naked eye, had been collected from the back seat. When tested, they revealed microscopic traces of Kayla's blood. There was no more space for doubt. Back in the interrogation room, Daniel remained still, his breathing slow, measured. He had asked for water at some point, had taken a sip before setting the cup down untouched for over an hour. His face betrayed nothing, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. But something had shifted in the air around him. The walls weren't just closing in, they were pressing down, suffocating. Detectives played the footage. The gas station camera, enhanced just enough to show the truck that had followed Kayla's car that morning. They laid out the evidence in front of him, piece by piece. The blood in his truck, the adhesive residue from the duct tape, the inconsistencies in his timeline. Daniel didn't react. But outside that room, beyond the walls of the station, a final discovery was being made. A search team had returned to the area surrounding the riverbank, expanding their efforts beyond the initial crime scene. The fire had consumed most of what had been inside the car, but fire alone wasn't always enough to erase everything. Buried beneath the wet soil, partially covered by leaves and debris, was the missing suitcase. The one Kayla would have taken if she had truly left on her own. It hadn't been packed in preparation for a journey. It had been stuffed haphazardly, the zipper barely closed over its contents. Clothes still folded, still bearing the scent of the detergent Kayla had used. A hairbrush, tangled with strands of her long blonde hair. A book, its pages warped from moisture, its spine cracked open to a passage she had read but never finished. And at the very bottom, beneath the layers of fabric, was a roll of duct tape, the same kind whose adhesive had been found on the fabric inside the car. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was proof of intent. By the time the detectives returned to the interrogation room, Daniel's posture had changed. His hands had curled into fists, his jaw set tight. He had yet to ask for a lawyer, yet to demand his release. And that, more than anything, sealed his fate. Because a man who was truly innocent would be fighting. A man who had nothing to hide wouldn't be sitting in silence, feeling the weight of the inevitable. Outside, night had fallen again. The same darkness that had once hidden a crime was now revealing it, piece by damning piece. It was over. The truth had finally risen to the surface. The air inside the interrogation room had changed. It was no longer filled with tense silence or controlled uncertainty. Now it was thick with inevitability, pressing down on Daniel Flaherty like a slow, suffocating weight. He had not spoken in hours. The quiet was no longer a strategy. It was a shield, one that was cracking with every new piece of evidence laid before him. Beyond the walls of the police station, the town was restless. The burned-out car had been on every news broadcast. The image of its charred remains burned into the public's mind. The discovery of Kayla's suitcase had only fueled the whispers, solidifying what most had already assumed. The search for a missing woman had become the pursuit of a killer, and though no one had yet said it out loud, everyone knew where that pursuit was leading. Inside the forensic lab, the results continued to pour in. The duct tape found inside Kayla's abandoned suitcase was a perfect match to the residue left on the fabric scrap recovered from the car. It had been used to restrain her. That much was clear. The blood found in the back seat of Daniel's truck had already been tested. It was Kayla's. That was undeniable. But there was something else. The medical examiner had worked meticulously, studying the remains that had survived the fire. Though the destruction had been severe, fire did not always erase everything. Beneath the layers of charred tissue and bone, deeper than the flames had reached, there was evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. Kayla had not died in the fire. She had already been dead when her body was placed inside the car. That fact alone shifted the entire case. Fire had not been the weapon, it had been a cover-up. Someone had tried to erase the evidence, to make it seem as though Kayla's death had been accidental or untraceable. But fire was rarely perfect. There were always remnants left behind, fragments of truth waiting to be found. In the interrogation room, the evidence was presented in silence. Daniel's hands remained still, his fingers curled slightly against the metal table. The images of the remains, the results of the forensic analysis, the surveillance footage. Each piece was placed in front of him, stripping away whatever illusion of control he had left. His breathing had changed. It was slower now, deeper, as if every inhale took effort. His posture remained rigid, his gaze locked forward, but his jaw had tightened, his knuckles whitening where they rested against the cold surface. Outside the room, the conversation had already turned to what came next. The case was strong, The timeline was broken beyond repair. The forensic evidence was undeniable. There was no more room for doubt, no more possibility that this had been anything other than what it was, a premeditated act. The district attorney was already reviewing the file, preparing for the formal charges. There was no question that Daniel would be arrested, but there was one final detail that still remained unanswered. Why? The motive had been clear in fragments. The divorce, the growing tension, the fear that Kayla had carried in her final days. But what had happened inside that house in the hours leading up to her death? What had pushed things past the point of no return? The detectives knew that the best confessions did not always come from direct confrontation. The weight of guilt, when placed under enough pressure, had a way of breaking through on its own. The evidence had already spoken. The truth was no longer something that needed to be proven. It was something waiting to be acknowledged. Daniel's breathing shifted again, a slight tremor in his exhale. His fingers twitched, just barely. The weight was pressing down, heavier now, pushing past whatever defenses he had left. He knew what was coming. They all did. And when the silence finally broke, it was not with an admission, not with an outburst, not with a declaration of guilt. It was with the sound of the door unlocking as detectives prepared to take the next step. Because Daniel Flaherty wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was about to be charged with murder. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the town of Patoka was no longer whispering. The quiet speculation that had simmered beneath the surface had transformed into something louder, something undeniable. The truth was no longer hidden behind closed doors or confined within the walls of the police station. It was out in the open now, circulating through conversations at breakfast diners, filling the spaces between morning news reports, spreading across social media like wildfire. Daniel Flaherty had been arrested for the murder of his wife. The news had traveled fast, as it always did in a town like this. His name, once spoken with familiarity, now carried the weight of something darker. The man who had stood in his driveway just days earlier, pleading for answers about his missing wife, was now being led out of the police station in handcuffs. The cameras had been waiting. Local reporters had gathered outside before dawn, tipped off by sources inside the department. The flashing of bulbs cut through the early morning light as Daniel was escorted to the squad car, his face unreadable, his body rigid with the tension of someone whose world had just been stripped away. He didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't look at the cameras. The officers on either side of him remained expressionless, their grips firm as they guided him forward. The door shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. Inside the police station, the weight of the case settled over every desk, every officer, every file stacked neatly in preparation for what came next. The investigation had led them here, to this moment, but it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The district attorney's office was already assembling their case. The charges were clear: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The forensic analysis had built an irrefutable narrative. Kayla had not left home that night of her own free will. She had been restrained, injured, and ultimately killed before her body was placed inside the burning wreckage of her own car. The fire had not been meant to conceal her. It had been meant to erase her. But fire could not destroy everything. And now the evidence stood against Daniel like a mountain he could not climb. Inside the holding cell, he sat alone, staring at the concrete floor beneath his feet. The weight of his arrest had settled over him, but he did not move, did not shift, did not speak. Outside, his name was already being dissected, his past examined under a microscope, his every action picked apart by people who had once considered him a friend, a neighbor, a father. The courtroom would be next. The trial would bring the town to a standstill, force people to choose sides, to question how well they had ever truly known the man they had seen mowing his lawn, picking up his children from school, standing beside Kayla at church on Sundays. The evidence would be presented. The testimony would be heard. The jury would decide. But for now, for these fleeting moments before the legal system took over, the weight of it all rested inside this building, inside this single room where a man sat in silence, awaiting the fate that had already been decided long before the handcuffs ever touched his wrists. Outside, the town continued to wake. The day moved forward, but nothing would ever be the same again. The wheels of justice had begun turning, slow but relentless. The moment Daniel Flaherty had been led away in handcuffs, The machinery of the legal system engaged in full force. The arrest was just the beginning. Now came the trial, the courtroom, the long process of peeling apart every layer of his life until the truth was laid bare. In the district attorney's office, the case against him was being assembled piece by piece. Every piece of evidence, every forensic detail, every inconsistency in his timeline was being scrutinized. The prosecution wasn't just building a case, they were constructing a story, one that would be delivered in a way that left no room for doubt. The jury would not just be presented with facts. They would be guided through the last hours of Kayla Flaherty's life, forced to walk in her footsteps, to feel the rising fear she must have felt in those final moments. The forensic evidence was already airtight. The blood in the truck, the duct tape fibers, the blunt force trauma confirmed by the medical examiner, it all pointed to one conclusion. But a trial wasn't one on forensics alone. It was about narrative, about intent, about proving beyond any reasonable doubt that this had been planned, deliberate, not an accident, not a moment of lost control. The prosecution worked late into the night, piecing together the sequence of events that had led to Kayla's murder. The text she had sent to Maggie hours before she disappeared would be a key piece of evidence. A final warning, a desperate attempt to leave a message behind in case she didn't get another chance. Then there was the fact that Kayla had filed for divorce. The documents were there, filed just weeks before her death. The reasoning, irreconcilable differences, fear for her safety, a husband who refused to let go. That was the motive. Daniel hadn't just lost control. He had seen his life slipping away, his control over Kayla breaking apart, and he had made a choice. He had ensured that if he couldn't have her, no one could. The prosecution would argue that this was never about passion or anger. This was about possession. But for all their confidence, there was still the matter of what Daniel would say in his defense. He hadn't spoken much since his arrest, but his legal team was already forming a strategy. He had finally requested a lawyer, and now the preparation had begun. The defense would argue lack of intent. They would paint Daniel as a man who had simply snapped, overcome by the stress of his failing marriage. They would try to dismantle the idea that this was premeditated, that the killing had been a calculated act rather than a moment of blind rage. There would be a battle over the evidence, over what could be admitted in court, over how much of Kayla's fear could be used against Daniel. The defense would fight to keep certain details out: the text message, the divorce filings, the bruises that Kayla had once hidden beneath her sleeves but that her friends had seen anyway. They would argue that past troubles did not prove murder, that no one truly knew what happened in that house in the final hours of Kayla's life, except Daniel himself. But there was one thing they couldn't argue. Kayla Flaherty had not set herself on fire. She had not driven herself into the woods, restrained by duct tape, already dead before the flames ever touched her skin. She had not erased herself. That truth, simple and absolute, would be the prosecution's greatest weapon. As the trial loomed, the town braced itself for what was coming. The courtroom would become a stage. The lawyers would battle over Daniel's fate. The jury would be drawn into the most intimate, most horrifying details of a crime that had shattered everything. And in the end, justice would come down to who told the most convincing story. The courthouse had never felt so suffocating. Every seat in the gallery was filled, every hallway packed with murmurs, every face tense with anticipation. The town had waited for this moment, had followed every update, had dissected every new development in the case, and now it was finally here. The trial of Daniel Flaherty had begun. The weight of what was about to unfold could be felt in the air. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it was a stage. The prosecution and the defense stood as opposing storytellers, each prepared to craft their version of events, each determined to make the jury believe their truth. The prosecution's case was built on cold, indisputable facts. The forensic evidence, the inconsistencies in Daniel's timeline, the physical proof that Kayla had been restrained, beaten, and killed before her body was burned, all of it painted a picture too detailed, too deliberate to be anything but murder. The prosecution would argue that Daniel had planned this, that he had been driven not by a moment of rage, but by a slow, calculated decision to take control in the only way he knew how. But the defense was ready with a counter-narrative. They would attempt to dismantle the prosecution's carefully constructed timeline, challenge the evidence as circumstantial, argue that the emotional weight of the case was clouding reason. They would portray Daniel as a man consumed by desperation, not malice. They would push for doubt, for uncertainty, for the idea that no one really knew what had happened behind closed doors in the final hours of Kayla Flaherty's life. The jury had been selected carefully. 12 individuals pulled from the surrounding counties, people who had claimed they could be fair, that they could listen to the facts and separate themselves from the media storm that had surrounded the case. But no matter how carefully chosen they were, no one could ignore the undercurrent of expectation. The town was watching. The country was watching. The verdict in this case would not just determine the fate of one man, but would send a message about justice, about belief, about what happened when a woman tried to leave and didn't make it. The first days of the trial were spent laying the foundation. The prosecution opened with precision, presenting the jury with a clear, unshakable sequence of events. They painted the picture of a woman who had tried to escape a toxic marriage, a woman who had reached out for help, a woman who had known, deep in her gut, that something was coming. Kayla's text message to Maggie was presented as evidence. The words, "If anything happens to me, just remember, I tried to leave," were displayed in stark black letters against a glowing screen. The courtroom was silent as the jury absorbed those words, as they imagined what it must have meant for Kayla to type them in the darkness of her home, the last message she would ever send. Then came the forensic evidence. The blood in Daniel's truck, the traces of duct tape on Kayla's skin, the partial fingerprint lifted from the bathroom counter where she had likely braced herself in her final moments, all of it methodically laid out, all of it leading to one conclusion. The prosecution did not need to tell the jury what had happened that night. The evidence was telling the story for them. But the defense fought back, weaving doubt wherever they could. They questioned the reliability of the forensic process, suggested alternative explanations, hinted that there were missing pieces the prosecution had ignored. They argued that Kayla had been emotionally unstable, that she had left on her own, and that something tragic had happened after the fact, something that had nothing to do with Daniel Flaherty. But if that was true, the prosecution countered, then why had Kayla's suitcase been found hidden, packed but never taken? Why had her body shown clear signs of restraint? Why had Daniel scrubbed the floor, erased her blood, failed to report her missing until the evidence had become too overwhelming to ignore? The battle in the courtroom was not just about facts, it was about perception. The prosecution needed the jury to feel the weight of Kayla's final moments, to understand the fear she had carried with her. The defense needed the jury to question everything, to hesitate just long enough for doubt to creep in. Outside the courthouse, reporters dissected every moment. Every statement made by the prosecution was analyzed. Every response from the defense scrutinized. Kayla's family attended every session, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what had been lost. And Daniel, he sat at the defense table, stiff, unmoving, his eyes fixed forward. He had chosen not to testify. His defense team had decided it was too risky, that any crack in his story would shatter what little ground they had left. Instead, the evidence spoke for him. The jury watched, listened, absorbed. The weight of what they were being asked to decide pressed down on them. The facts were clear. The arguments had been made. Soon they would have to decide what they believed. The trial was far from over, but the truth had already settled over the courtroom, heavy and inescapable. Justice was coming. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that carried weight, that pressed against the walls and filled the space between every breath. The kind of silence that came before something irreversible. The jury had been out for 2 days, 48 hours of deliberation, of combing through evidence, of weighing the arguments that had been made. Outside the courthouse, reporters lined the steps, waiting for the inevitable moment when the doors would open and the world would finally hear what had been decided. Inside, Kayla's family sat rigid, their hands folded in their laps, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion. This wasn't just about a trial for them. This was about closure, about the closest thing to justice they could get for a woman who should still be alive. Daniel Flaherty sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes locked forward, his face unreadable. For days he had listened as his life was dissected, as every moment leading up to Kayla's death was examined under a microscope. He had heard the prosecution unravel his carefully constructed version of events, had watched as forensic experts trace the evidence back to him, had sat in silence as Kayla's voice, through text messages, through testimonies, through the physical proof she had unknowingly left behind, spoke louder than he ever could. Now everything came down to this. The bailiff called for order as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreman, an older man with steady hands, held the verdict slip in his grasp. He had read it already, had felt the weight of the words he was about to say. The judge's voice cut through the air, measured and calm. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Kayla's mother exhaled sharply, gripping her daughter's hand. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, as if bracing for impact. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant—" A pause, a heartbeat. "Guilty." The words landed like a final blow. A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back of the courtroom muffled a sob. Kayla's mother shut her eyes, her body trembling as the weight of the moment settled in. Daniel didn't move, didn't flinch. His hands remained clasped in front of him, his jaw set, his expression unchanged. But in his eyes there was something, a flicker, a moment of realization that whatever fight he had left, whatever argument he had been holding on to, had just been erased. The sentencing was swift. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. As the judge's gavel fell, the courtroom finally exhaled. It wasn't relief, not entirely. Nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could bring Kayla back. But this was something. This was an answer. The reporters outside erupted into a frenzy as the news broke. The case that had gripped the town, that had pulled the country into its orbit, had reached its conclusion. But for those closest to it, for the people who had loved Kayla, it wasn't just a headline. It was the final chapter of something they had never wanted to be a part of. As the courtroom emptied, as the weight of the trial began to settle into history, Maggie Reed lingered at the back of the gallery, her fingers brushing over the phone in her pocket. The same phone that still held Kayla's last message. "If anything happens to me, just remember, I tried to leave." Maggie inhaled deeply, then let the phone slip back into her bag. Kayla had tried to leave, and now, in the only way that was left, she finally had. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.